Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Mike Grier and his first full year as San Jose Sharks GM. Now, technically, it hasn't been a full year. We're about a month and a half, couple months away from him actually having his 1-year anniversary as general manager of the San Jose Sharks, but he has an entry draft, a free agency, a preseason, a training camp, an entire regular season, a trade deadline, all under his belt at this point, and the next notable part of this season is next year's entry draft. So technically, I'd say we've gotten just about a full years of exposure to Mike Grier's moves, and so I will be taking a look at many of those moves that he did make over this year and evaluating whether they were good moves, whether they were bad moves, or whether they found themselves somewhere in the middle as kind of meh, not particularly noticeable moves. On top of that, we will also have a couple of undecided moves from Mike Grier's perspective for this past year, usually the two biggest moves of the year, and this is because they are pretty difficult to evaluate just how good or bad they are at this point. And jumping immediately into those undecided moves, we first have the Timo Meier trade. Now, first, when this trade was announced, it was one that did not really jump off the page, wasn't particularly exciting if you were a San Jose Sharks fan. They were expected to potentially get a really good roster player like Dawson Mercer, but they ended up with Fabian Zetterlund. They were expected to get a really good prospect, potentially like a Luke Hughes or an Alexander Holt, and they ended up with Shakir Mukhamadullin. So it was relatively disappointing at the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean things aren't going to pan out well for the San Jose Sharks from this trade. It's actually kind of reminiscent to the Erik Karlsson deal that the Sharks made a few years ago to acquire him from the Ottawa Senators. Immediately, it looked like a huge win for the San Jose Sharks and a massive loss by the Ottawa Senators, but just a few years later, because of how well Josh Norris panned out, and admittedly because of the fact that the Sharks somehow completely fell off a cliff and ended up giving them third overall pick, it ended up actually being a very good trade for the Senators. And while the Sharks aren't going to get a free third overall pick from the New Jersey Devils, it's literally impossible for that to happen. It's still a situation where you never know, maybe Mukhamadullin can end up panning out as a very good defensive prospect for the Sharks, and then one of at least their current first round pick from the Devils this year and the potential first round pick next year, one of those players could also end up being really good, and at the end of the day it'll look like a strong trade for the San Jose Sharks. So right now it's kind of being balanced on a knife's edge. It doesn't look amazing immediately, but in maybe 2-3 years we can look back and say that this was a strong deal for Mike Grier. We shall see. The other trade like this is the draft day trade, which is when the Sharks traded down from 11th overall to pick up 3 picks in that year's draft. For the obvious one is the first round pick at 27th overall, as well as a couple of early second round picks. And so instead of picking at 11th, where they could have gotten a relatively strong player, or at least predicted to be a relatively strong player, the Sharks ended up with Philip Bystedt, Cam Lund, and Matthias Havlid. Now, again, very difficult to evaluate. None of these players, either the 3 that the Sharks drafted or the one that the Coyotes drafted, as that's who the Sharks traded with, have actually played any NHL games, so we can't evaluate how good of a trade this necessarily was. It's just the fact that the Sharks decided to go with more of a quantity approach than a quality approach. As we already knew, this 2022 draft was predicted to be not necessarily the most hyped up and talented draft of the past many years. A lot of the top players even are not necessarily expected to be world beaters at the NHL level, and so it seemed as though Mike Grier wasn't particularly excited by any of the players who were available at 11th, and put a lot of trust in his scouting staff that they had identified particular players who would be available in the late parts of the first round and the early to mid parts of the second round, who the Sharks thought could actually pan out to be solid players. So like with the Meier trade, 2-3 years from now, we can look back and say, oh, well, how well is Philip Bystedt doing? How well is Lund doing? How well is Havlid doing? And we can also take a look at the Coyotes player and how well is that 11th overall or whoever the Sharks may have picked at that particular point. How well are they doing? And kind of evaluate how good of a trade this was. So while like the Meier trade, it looked relatively disappointing at first, it's something we'll have to check back in on in a couple of years. But now let us move on to the more direct moves, the moves that were quite easy to evaluate after just 1 year's time. And the first one here in the good column is the Nico Sturm trade. This is the Nico Sturm signing, I should say, picked up from the Colorado Avalanche in free agency after he had just won a Stanley Cup, signed $2 million for 3 years. I had thought this was a bit of a long contract for a player who was likely to play on the fourth line, but over this past year, Nico Sturm has shown himself to be a pretty effective third line center who kind of just drew the short end of the stick at times with the San Jose Sharks. I remember at the end of this past year, he was playing on a line with Noah Gregor and Kevin Labanc and looking really, really good. And then over the course of the next 3-4 games, both Gregor and Labanc were promoted up into the top 6, while Nico Sturm stood pat as the third line center, being stuck behind both Hertl and Logan Couture, and eventually ended up with worse wingers in that situation as a reward for having played so well in the previous few games. So it's a situation where Nico Sturm played quite good in that bottom 6 and ended up making worth for sure the $2 million that the Sharks paid him. The next very good trade was the Pettersson deal made near the trade deadline. The Sharks trading Scott Reedy to the Dallas Stars in return for Jacob Pettersson, looking like a pretty minor league deal that wasn't going to blow anybody away. And that is obviously the case for the Dallas Stars, who were a very good team, and so they're likely to maintain the status quo and not necessarily give Scott Reedy the time of day. But the Sharks, who of course were struggling to find any half-decent players to play in their top 9, decide to give Jacob Pettersson a chance, and he runs with that opportunity, ends up eventually being a Sharks first liner for the last few games of the season, playing a very, very solid game, putting up a decent amount of points, and has really showed himself as being a potential option for the San Jose Sharks going into next season. Maybe not necessarily in their top 6, though you never know, but for sure in their top 9, and we'll see exactly if Jacob Pettersson is able to carry that performance into next season. And then the final good move is the Henry Thrun trade and sign. A very bold move by Mike Grier for sure, because this was a situation where Thrun could have very easily decided to just not sign with the San Jose Sharks, and at that point the Sharks would have lost a third-round pick for free to the Anaheim Ducks. But Mike Grier, confident that they could get that player under contract, and they were able to do exactly that. Thrun ends up signing with the San Jose Sharks relatively soon after being acquired, and then in his short stint for the Sharks in the last few games of the season actually looked rather good, and this was an important move because of the fact that the San Jose Sharks had an extremely empty defensive cupboard in terms of prospects at that position. And so obviously the trade for acquiring Shakir Mukhamadullin from the New Jersey Devils and the Timo Meier deal was a big one, but being able to also get Henry Thrun essentially for free, technically not for free because they do have to give up a third round pick, but Henry Thrun, the type of player he is likely to pan out better than any third-round pick. Actually, if we take a look at the 2019 draft, the year he was drafted, and look at just all of the third-round players, none of them have made any sort of impact in the NHL. So at best, they'll end up just as good as Henry Thrun, but realistically, Thrun could very much outperform all of them. So a very good trade for Mike Grier for sure. Now we move on to the more average type of deals, and you'll actually notice that not every single move that Mike Grier has made is on this board for this past season. And this is because obviously I don't necessarily have the time to talk about literally every single move. The moves that aren't on the board are also kind of in this category. For instance, the Jacob Megna to the Seattle Kraken for a 4th round pick, or the Aiden Hill to the Vegas Golden Knights for a 4th round pick, or the Nick Bonino trade. And these moves not necessarily moving the needle all that much, and we're just kind of average in general. But the other average moves that are relatively notable, first would be the Matt Benning signing. Now originally when this signing was made, I wasn't super happy about it because of the fact that you're signing a bottom 6 defenseman or a bottom pairing defenseman for 4 years, even if it is a relatively cheap amount, which just seemed a bit odd. But Matt Benning ends up outperforming expectations, playing as a pretty decent top 4 defenseman. Not great, certainly more of like a number 4 in the top 4, but still half decent. And even though there's definitely a possibility that he can kind of fall back down to earth as the seasons move on in his insane still 4-year contract, it is a situation where I am slightly more okay with it than I was when it was originally signed. And so while it doesn't actually get into the good category, it ends up being an okay move for the Sharks. The next on this list is Nieto, the Matt Nieto trade, another trade that immediately I was thinking, oh, this isn't a very good one, as the Sharks traded Matt Nieto as well as Ryan Merkley to the Avalanche in exchange for Martin Kaut and Jacob McDonald. Now originally I had thought that Nieto, the Sharks would have been able to get a draft draft pick from him, a 5th and potentially even a 4th round pick in next year's draft, which would have been decent enough value for the player that Matt Nieto is, but instead they get back McDonald and Kaut, who I had originally viewed as players who would not really make much of an impact with the San Jose Sharks. And while I was technically right about Jacob McDonald, because he doesn't really have much of a future with the Sharks, it feels like, Martin Kaut actually looked decent enough in the few games that he played with the San Jose Sharks that he could potentially be a okay player for the Sharks moving forward. And while I don't necessarily think he'll be a big part of them and a big part of this franchise in 5 years' time at this point, I do think he can play a big enough role that is likely to equal the value of a 4th or 5th round pick. So it ends up being a decent enough trade. Also, I was relatively disappointed with the departure of Ryan Merkley in this deal, because of the fact that he was technically still the Sharks' best defensive prospect at that point, because of the players behind him were not particularly impressive. But with the Sharks kind of filling in that spot with Mukhamadullin and Henry Thrun, definitely much lesser of a loss, and Ryan Merkley may very well never even pan out to be an NHL player. And then finally, we have the Brent Burns trade. Now, this one might be slightly controversial because Brent Burns has been playing an exceptional season thus far with the Carolina Hurricanes. Of course, that team is in the Eastern Conference Final, and Brent Burns is a pretty big part of that. Some people saying so far as he could be the Conn Smythe favorite if the Hurricanes were to actually win the Stanley Cup, and was a potential Norris candidate, maybe not necessarily top 3, but certainly in like the top 10 for a lot of people. So Brent Burns has been playing exceptionally well, and so the Sharks and many Sharks fans might be thinking, well, they could have gotten more from this deal, and that could technically be true, but it's important to remember Brent Burns had a lot of control in this situation. I believe he had just a 3-team list of teams he could actually be traded for, which obviously limits the amount of negotiating power that the San Jose Sharks have. On top of that, Brent Burns was to be turning 38 years old near the end of this season, and even though Brent Burns has proven himself even at his older age that he is still a very good hockey player, you never know when you're going to just absolutely fall off a cliff. It could have easily happened this past season. So the Sharks being able to get out from under the $5.5 million contract, since they retained a decent chunk of it from the Carolina Hurricanes, and still not have to unload extra assets for themselves, and got back half decent assets, with Steven Lorentz being a pretty good 4th liner, a 3rd round pick, as well as a half decent goaltending prospect in Eetu Makiniemi. This ends up being a deal that, if you take a look sort of in hindsight at the player that Brent Burns currently is with the Hurricanes, it's not great. But if you consider a lot of the circumstances of what the deal was made at the time, it's certainly not a terrible deal. Definitely not enough to get it into the good section, but enough to get it out from the bad section. Moving on to that bad section, there definitely were some that still leave a bit of a sour mark on Mike Grier's rap sheet here. The first one being, of course, I've mentioned this many, many times in the past, the Luke Kunin trade and sign. This was just not a very good deal from the San Jose Sharks. They end up getting rid of John Leonard, who wasn't a notable prospect, but could have technically become something, but more notably a 3rd round pick to pick up Luke Kunin, who just wasn't the most impressive player even when he was with the Nashville Predators. A decent goal scorer, but if you take a look at his advanced stats, a really, really bad player in terms of actually keeping possession and playing defense, and that exact reputation continued going into San Jose. He put up okay numbers for the type of player he is. Offensive numbers weren't awful, but in terms of possession and defensive numbers, they were downright terrible, and would have looked even worse had he not actually been injured and missed more than half of this past season. So while technically he could improve in the final year of his actually sizable $2.75 million contract, it's a situation where the Sharks lost out on some half-decent assets to get a player who is not particularly good. The next player on this list, and this one's slightly more unfortunate, which was the Lindblom signing. Lindblom was originally a not super hyped up player with the Philadelphia Flyers, but he was looking pretty good with them as a middle 6 guy who could potentially develop into a top 6 guy. But as we know with Lindblom, the reason why he ended up being a Masterton nominee, he ran into some health issues, obviously, that I'm not necessarily going to get into, but it ended up amounting to him not necessarily being able to keep up the pace, unsurprisingly, with the things that he had to deal with in his personal life. But he ends up getting bought out then ends up as a free agent. The Sharks decide to take a chance on him, $2.5 million for 2 years, likely hoping that he could still be that sort of middle six type of player, potentially flexing up to the second line, and that's what I was hoping for going into this season for Lindblom. But in the end, he ends up being a half-decent fourth liner for the San Jose Sharks, who likely could have been a healthy scratch in many more of the games this season than he actually ended up being. He did develop some okay chemistry with Steven Lorentz near the end of the season and finished off the year decently well, but for a player who you're paying $2.5 million to get an okay fourth liner is not really a big win for Mike Grier and the San Jose Sharks, so it ends up being a pretty bad deal for them. And then finally, and then maybe this one is maybe a bit biased on my end, but I'm going to have the Eyssimont trade here as well. And this is because what ends up happening is the Sharks trade Eyssimont for a fourth round pick through like a sort of complicated channel of trading for Nemesnikov, who gets his contract retained by the Tampa Bay Lightning, and then they have to go trade him, or no, by the Winnipeg Jets, and then they have to trade him with the Tampa Bay Lightning. It's like a whole situation here. Eyssimont to the Lightning for Nemesnikov to the Jets for a fourth round pick, but in the end it ends up being Eyssimont for a fourth round pick. And technically, this isn't a terrible trade. This was a player who the Sharks picked up for free off of waivers from the Winnipeg Jets originally, and the fact that they end up getting a fourth round pick from him is not a terrible move. But the thing is that when Eyssimont was with San Jose, he played very, very well. Probably could have had a lot more points than he did if he wasn't so snake bitten with his opportunity and with his chances. Actually filled in relatively well in the top six, and he ends up getting traded in this situation, like I said, to the Tampa Bay Lightning. Plays games with that very, very storied and strong franchise. They've won the 2 of the last 3 Stanley Cups and made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in the 1 year that they didn't win. And they end up re-signing him to a deal, and many of the fans became very big fan favorites of Mikey Eyssimont because of just the way he plays the game, and that's exactly why Sharks fans also came to like him, and he plays the exact style of game that you would think Mike Grier would really enjoy out of a player. So if there was this one type of player who you would think that you wouldn't want to move on from, I felt as though it would be Mikey Eyssimont. But in the end, it's a deal where the Sharks, they come out okay from it, but it's just, I felt as though they could have kept this player. But that will do it for this video. In the end, Mike Grier had a very average season for the San Jose Sharks for sure. Some good moves, some bad moves, some average moves. Basically exactly what you would expect from a first-year GM. Threw a lot of darts at the dartboard, and some of them landed, but really the 2 big ones, the Meyer trade and the draft day trade down, are the 2 that we will really judge Mike Grier's first year on, and they're the 2 trades that we can't really come to much of a conclusion in, or to, for the next couple of years. Class dismissed.